Victory is loud, an old American colonel once said, but real honor is almost always quiet. The spring of 1945 arrived in Germany without celebration. The air carried the scent of wet earth and burned coal, and the sky hung low over a countryside that seemed exhausted by years of war. In a temporary prisoner camp outside a small Bavarian town, the morning began the same way it always did. Boots on gravel, the distant rumble of trucks, the metallic rattle of a gate sliding open. Rows of captured German officers stood in formation in the pale light of dawn. Their uniforms were worn but carefully maintained, collars straight, boots polished as best as circumstances allowed. Old habits did not disappear simply because the war had ended. Some of these men had commanded divisions. Some had led thousands across frozen rivers and endless plains. Now they stood quietly behind wire fences in a land that had once been their enemy. At the far end of the yard, an American flag lifted slowly in the cool morning breeze. Nearby, a young officer stepped into view. Captain Daniel Carter was 28 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with the steady posture of a man who had grown up working long days on an Oklahoma farm. Before the war, he had measured distance by fence lines and cornfields. Now he measured it by guard towers and watch rotations. The soldiers under his command respected him, though many still found it strange that someone so young carried the authority of the camp. Carter adjusted his cap and looked across the yard. The prisoners watched him with guarded expressions, the quiet curiosity of men studying the one who now held power over their routine, their meals, their sleep. The rules were simple. Officers maintained discipline. Prisoners followed instructions. Respect flowed through rank, even between enemies. A sergeant walked along the front row, calling the order in a firm voice. Officers, salute the commanding officer. One by one, German officers lifted their hands in formal military salute. The gesture was precise, almost automatic, a ritual drilled into them through decades of service. For a moment the yard moved like a machine, orderly, predictable, controlled. And then the motion stopped. Near the center of the formation stood a tall man with silver hair and a narrow scar along his jaw. His uniform, though faded, carried the insignia of a high command once respected across Europe. General Friedrich Adler had spent 35 years in the German army. He had studied strategy in Berlin, commanded troops through bitter winters, and survived battles that younger men rarely lived to remember. Even now, standing as a prisoner, he carried himself with a calm dignity that drew attention without effort. When the order was given, every officer raised his hand. Every officer except one. Adler remained perfectly still. His arms stayed at his sides. His gaze remained forward. 10 yards away, Captain Carter noticed immediately. Around them the yard seemed to pause, as if the morning itself had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. The sergeant turned back, confused at first, then annoyed. "General," he said sharply through the interpreter, "that includes you." Adler did not move. The wind stirred dust across the ground. Somewhere beyond the fence a crow called from the branch of a leafless tree. The general's posture never changed. It was not defiance in the dramatic sense. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, no challenge shouted across the yard. There was simply stillness. The kind of stillness that belonged to a man who had decided something long ago and saw no reason to change it now. Several American soldiers shifted their weight, unsure whether to laugh, shout, or intervene. One muttered under his breath. Another tightened his grip on the strap of his rifle. But Captain Carter did none of those things. He simply watched the old general standing in silence among a line of men who had already saluted. And in that quiet moment, before a single word was spoken, something unusual settled over the camp. Something heavier than authority and far more complicated than victory. The silence that followed did not feel ordinary. It carried weight, the kind that settles slowly into a place where men understand hierarchy, pride, and the invisible lines that separate them. Captain Daniel Carter studied the man who had refused the order. General Friedrich Adler stood nearly 6 feet tall, though the years had bent his shoulders only slightly. His hair was silver at the temples, cut short in the disciplined style of an officer who had spent a lifetime under regulation. Even without the insignia on his uniform, anyone in the yard would have recognized him as a man accustomed to command. Some people carried authority the way. Others carried a coat. It hung naturally on their shoulders. Carter had read the file the night before. Every prisoner officer arriving at the camp had one. A simple folder, thin brown paper, the type used in every military office across Europe. Inside Adler's file were a few pages of typewritten notes and a black and white photograph taken years earlier. The photograph showed a younger version of the same man, standing beside a staff car somewhere on the Eastern Front. The caption listed decorations, assignments, campaigns that stretched across a map from Poland to the Caucasus Mountains. Carter remembered closing the folder slowly after reading it. 35 years of military service. Nearly his entire life. Now that same man stood 10 yards away, refusing the smallest gesture of surrender. The American sergeant shifted his stance and looked toward Carter for instruction. The young captain did not respond immediately. Instead, he took a few quiet steps forward across the gravel yard. Each step produced the dry crunch of small stones under his boots. The prisoners watched closely. Soldiers always noticed movement. They studied posture, rhythm, hesitation. The details revealed more than words ever could. Adler followed the captain's approach without turning his head. His eyes moved slightly, tracking Carter the way an experienced officer observed a battlefield. Calm, measured, analytical. The interpreter standing beside the formation cleared his throat softly, uncertain whether to repeat the order. Carter raised one hand slightly, and the interpreter fell silent again. 10 yards became 8. 8 became 6. Carter stopped just beyond arm's length from the general. Up close, the difference in age was striking. Carter's face carried the sun-browned look of a man not yet 30. Adler's face held the deeper lines of someone who had watched decades pass through the same uniform. For a moment, neither man spoke. A breeze moved across the open yard, carrying the faint smell of damp wood from the nearby barracks. Somewhere behind the fence, a truck engine started and then faded as it drove down the dirt road beyond the camp. Life continued in small, ordinary ways even when history paused. Carter finally spoke, his voice even and calm. The interpreter translated the words into German. The question was simple. Was there a reason the general had chosen not to salute? Several prisoners lowered their eyes. Others watched Adler carefully, aware that whatever happened next would be remembered. The old general did not rush his reply. He lifted his chin slightly and answered in measured German that required little translation. He said that a soldier gave his salute to command earned through years of service, not to youth alone. The interpreter hesitated before repeating the words in English. A few American soldiers exchanged glances. One of them gave a small breath of disbelief. Yet the general's voice had not carried insult. It had carried something older than pride. Tradition. Carter listened without interrupting. The statement might have sounded like arrogance to some men. To others it sounded like a principle held too tightly to abandon. The captain looked across the formation again. Dozens of German officers stood watching with careful neutrality. These were men who understood military honor the way farmers understood seasons. It shaped everything they did. Carter thought briefly about his father back in Oklahoma, a quiet man who believed respect was never something demanded by volume. It was demonstrated by conduct. The captain removed one glove slowly and folded it into his palm. Gravel shifted under his boot as he adjusted his stance. The movement was small, but it carried the quiet certainty of a decision forming. Around them, the camp remained silent. Even the soldiers along the fence seemed to lean forward slightly, sensing that whatever happened next would be talked about long after the war itself had faded into history. Captain Daniel Carter did not answer immediately. The yard remained suspended in that strange quiet that sometimes appears when two men stand at the center of attention and everyone else senses that something important is unfolding. The young captain studied the general carefully. Up close, he could see the faint weathering of decades on the older man's face, the pale line of the scar near his jaw, the steady composure that belonged to someone who had spent half a lifetime giving orders and watching men carry them out. Friedrich Adler did not appear angry. He did not appear nervous. He simply appeared certain. Carter had met men like that before, though rarely in a prisoner yard. During the war, he had seen them on distant ridgelines or across negotiation tables after a town surrendered. Older officers who believed deeply in the rituals that defined their profession. Salutes. Titles. The invisible language of respect between soldiers. Carter turned his head slightly and glanced toward the American guards along the fence line. Some of them were barely older than 20. One of them had arrived from Kansas only 3 months earlier and still wrote letters home every Sunday afternoon. These young men had crossed an ocean, fought across unfamiliar countryside, and now stood responsible for guarding officers who had once commanded armies. War rearranged life in ways that textbooks never explained. Carter shifted his weight slowly and looked back at the general. The interpreter waited quietly beside them, hands folded behind his back. The formation of German officers remained motionless, though Carter could feel their attention fixed on the two men standing in the center of the gravel yard. Adler's words still hung in the air, not spoken loudly, not intended as insult, but firm in the way a principle sometimes becomes stronger with age. Carter considered them carefully. He could have answered in a dozen different ways. Regulations allowed him to insist. The sergeant would have supported him. The guards would have stepped forward if necessary. Authority was clear. Yet something about the general's tone made the situation feel different from a simple refusal. It felt older than the war that had just ended. Carter removed his cap slowly and brushed a small trace of dust from the brim with his thumb. The motion was calm, almost casual, but every soldier in the yard noticed it. Small gestures often carried meaning inside military life. The captain lowered his arm and held the cap briefly at his side. His eyes returned to the general. For a moment neither man spoke. Adler seemed to study the young American the same way one officer evaluates another during a quiet inspection. Carter wondered what the older man saw. Perhaps only a farm boy who had risen through wartime necessity. Perhaps something else. The captain thought again about his father's voice years earlier on their porch in Oklahoma during a long summer evening. His father had once told him that a man never proved his strength by forcing another man to bow. Strength showed itself when a person knew exactly when force was unnecessary. Carter inhaled slowly and then stepped half a pace closer. Gravel shifted under his boots again. The sound carried across the yard. The captain straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the general. Then, in a motion so simple that it took several seconds for the watching soldiers to fully understand what had happened, Daniel Carter raised his right hand to his brow and gave a precise, formal military salute. The movement was perfect in its discipline. Elbow angled correctly, fingers straight, palm angled downward just as the training manuals required. For a moment no one moved. The American guard stared as if the air had shifted around them. Several German officers lifted their heads slightly, confusion crossing their faces. Even the interpreter looked uncertain whether he had witnessed the gesture correctly. The salute remained steady for a long, quiet second. Carter held it without hesitation. There was no challenge in the motion, no sarcasm, only respect given from one soldier to another. Friedrich Adler blinked once. It was the first visible reaction the old general had shown since the moment he refused the order. His eyes moved briefly to the captain's raised hand, and then back to the young man's face. Something subtle changed in his expression. Not surrender. Something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Around them, the morning air remained still. The crow beyond the fence called once again from its branch, and somewhere down the road the sound of the departing truck faded into the distance. History had placed these two men on opposite sides of a war that had reshaped continents. Yet in that silent yard, under a pale Bavarian sky, the meaning of victory and defeat seemed suddenly less certain than anyone had expected. For a long moment no one moved. Captain Daniel Carter held the salute exactly as military discipline required, his posture straight, his expression calm. The gesture did not carry triumph. It carried something quieter, something older than the war that had ended only weeks before. The American guards along the fence line stared in open confusion. One young private from Iowa shifted his weight and glanced at the sergeant beside him as if waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. The sergeant himself looked uncertain. He had expected the captain to repeat the order, perhaps to insist more firmly. That was how authority usually worked. Yet the scene unfolding in front of them followed a different logic, one not written in any regulation manual. Across the formation, the German officers watched carefully. Many of them had served under General Friedrich Adler for years before the collapse of their armies. They recognized the quiet gravity of the moment. Adler remained perfectly still at first. His eyes rested on the young American captain standing before him with his hand raised in formal respect. The gesture seemed to echo across the years between them, bridging the distance between a man who had begun his career when cavalry still patrolled European roads and another who had grown up during the Great Depression on a farm thousands of miles away. For Adler, the war had lasted nearly his entire adult life. For Carter, it had begun only after he finished college. Yet both men understood the meaning of a salute. It was not simply obedience. It was recognition of another soldier's duty. The breeze moved again across the open yard, stirring a faint swirl of dust near the boots of the prisoners. Adler looked down briefly, noticing the movement of gravel underfoot, then lifted his gaze once more to the captain. Something thoughtful appeared in his eyes. Not defeat, not resentment, something closer to reflection. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the older man straightened his shoulders. His back seemed to regain a few inches of height as decades of habit returned. The watching officers felt the change immediately. It was the same posture they had seen countless times on parade grounds and headquarters courtyards across Europe. The posture of command. Adler raised his right hand. The motion was deliberate and measured, the kind of movement that comes from long training repeated thousands of times across a lifetime. His fingers aligned precisely, palm angled just enough to satisfy the strict traditions of the German officer corps. For a brief second, the two men stood facing each other with their hands raised in matching salutes. The effect was quiet but powerful. An American captain and a German general, separated by age, language, and a war that had reshaped the world, now acknowledging each other with the same ancient gesture of military respect. Around them the yard seemed to breathe again. One of the American soldiers released a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. The interpreter blinked and glanced from one officer to the other, understanding that he was witnessing something that could never be translated into words alone. Carter lowered his hand first, replacing his cap slowly on his head. Adler followed a moment later, his arm returning to his side with the calm precision of an officer concluding an inspection. Neither man smiled. Neither offered further explanation. Yet something subtle had shifted among the soldiers watching. The tension that had filled the air only minutes earlier softened into a thoughtful silence. A few of the younger American guards looked at the general with new curiosity rather than suspicion. Several German officers straightened their uniforms instinctively, reminded that dignity could survive even inside a prisoner camp. Captain Carter turned slightly and looked toward the waiting sergeant. His voice remained steady when he spoke, carrying across the yard with quiet authority. The morning inspection would continue. Routine would resume. But the soldiers present understood that they had witnessed something unusual, something that would likely be told and retold long after the fences of the camp were dismantled. As the formation shifted back into motion, General Friedrich Adler allowed himself a single brief glance toward the young American captain. The look lasted less than a second, yet it carried the unmistakable acknowledgement one professional soldier gives another. Not surrender, not friendship, simply respect earned in an unexpected moment beneath a pale Bavarian sky. The routine of the camp returned slowly after the inspection ended, but the quiet energy of the morning did not disappear. Soldiers moved back to their duties, boots crossing the gravel yard, gates opening and closing with their familiar metallic rattle. Yet the moment between Captain Daniel Carter and General Friedrich Adler lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Small conversations began almost immediately. An American corporal walking the perimeter leaned toward another guard and spoke in a low voice, asking if he had seen what the captain had done. The other soldier nodded slowly, still uncertain how to interpret it. In most camps, discipline flowed in one direction. Orders went out, and obedience followed. But what they had seen that morning felt different. It felt like something older than regulation. Near the barracks, several German officers gathered quietly as they were dismissed from formation. They spoke in careful German, their voices calm but thoughtful. Many of them had spent years under Adler's command. They had seen him in field headquarters, in winter trenches, and during long staff briefings that stretched late into the night. The man they knew had never been careless with ceremony. A salute meant something to him. Always had. Yet what surprised them was not his refusal earlier that morning. It was the expression that had crossed his face after the American captain returned the gesture. It had been brief, almost invisible, but those who knew Adler recognized it immediately. Respect acknowledged. Not victory. Not defeat. Simply recognition between professionals. Inside the command office, Captain Carter removed his gloves and placed them neatly on the small wooden desk beside a stack of paperwork. The room smelled faintly of oil and damp pine boards. Sunlight filtered through a narrow window and rested across a map of southern Germany pinned to the wall. The war might have ended, but the work of managing thousands of prisoners continued every day. Reports needed signatures. Supply trucks needed schedules. Guards rotated through their posts in steady shifts that never stopped. The captain sat down and opened the folder containing Adler's file again. The photograph stared back at him, the same younger officer standing beside a military car somewhere far from this quiet Bavarian valley. Carter studied the image for a moment. It was strange how war compressed entire lives into a few sheets of paper. Decades of service summarized in typed lines and official stamps. Carter closed the folder slowly and leaned back in his chair. He did not regret what he had done. In fact, the decision now felt even clearer than it had in the yard. Some soldiers believed that authority required constant demonstration. Others understood that authority became stronger when it did not need to be forced. Outside the office window, the camp moved through its afternoon routine. A group of prisoners carried crates from a supply truck toward the storage building. American guards walked nearby, their rifles slung comfortably across their shoulders. The atmosphere remained professional, neither hostile nor friendly, simply orderly. Later that afternoon, General Adler walked slowly along the narrow path beside the barracks reserved for officers. The wooden buildings stood in neat rows about 40 yards from the outer fence. A few prisoners sat on benches nearby, speaking quietly in the soft tones of men accustomed to long waiting. Adler moved with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back the way he had walked during inspections years earlier. As he passed, several officers nodded respectfully. One younger colonel hesitated before speaking. He asked quietly whether the general had expected the American captain to return the salute. Adler paused for a moment. His eyes drifted across the open yard toward the command building where Carter worked. The sun hung low now, casting long shadows across the gravel and wire fencing. The general remained silent long enough that the younger officer wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, Adler spoke in a calm voice that carried the quiet certainty of experience. He said that respect among soldiers sometimes appeared in unexpected ways, and when it did, a wise man recognized it. The colonel nodded slowly, understanding that the comment carried more meaning than its few simple words. Adler continued his walk toward the barracks door, his posture straight, his steps steady. Behind him, the camp remained quiet beneath the fading Bavarian sunlight, a place where two men from different worlds had briefly reminded everyone present that dignity did not belong to one uniform alone. The evening settled slowly over the camp, bringing with it the cool quiet that followed long days of routine. The Bavarian hills beyond the wire fences turned deep shades of blue as the sun disappeared behind distant ridgelines. Lamps began to glow along the gravel paths, their soft yellow light reflecting off the metal of the fences and the windows of the wooden barracks. Inside the officer quarters, conversations remained low and measured. Prisoners had learned quickly that time inside a camp moved differently than it had during the war. Days stretched longer. Silence carried further. Small events gained weight simply because there were so few distractions. General Friedrich Adler sat at a narrow wooden table near the window of the barracks assigned to senior officers. A thin notebook lay open in front of him. The pages were mostly blank. The camp authorities allowed prisoners to keep personal journals, provided the writing contained nothing related to military secrets or escape attempts. For many officers, the notebooks had become a way to organize long hours of reflection. Adler held a pencil loosely in his fingers, but had not written a word yet. His eyes drifted toward the window where the fading sky cast dim light across the camp yard. In the distance, he could see one of the watchtowers rising above the fence line, its silhouette steady against the darkening horizon. The guard inside moved occasionally, shifting position to watch the outer road that ran past the camp entrance. Adler had seen hundreds of guard towers during the war, on both sides of many front lines. Yet this one felt strangely different. It was quiet, routine, almost ordinary. A knock sounded lightly at the barracks door. One of the younger officers stepped inside after receiving permission. He carried a tin cup filled with the evening ration of coffee that the American kitchen distributed after supper. The man offered the cup respectfully and placed it on the table before the general. The steam rose gently in the cool air. Adler thanked him with a brief nod. The officer hesitated, then asked a question that several others had been quietly wondering since the morning inspection. He asked what the general had thought of the American captain. Adler did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the cup and took a slow sip of the coffee. It was stronger than what German officers had received near the end of the war, and the warmth spread through his hands in a way that reminded him of colder winters long ago. Finally, he set the cup back on the table and looked toward the dim yard outside the window. He said that the young captain understood something many older commanders often forgot. The officer waited, sensing that more would follow. Adler explained that power in war was temporary. Armies advanced and retreated. Governments rose and fell. Yet the profession of a soldier rested on traditions that outlasted any single conflict. One of those traditions was respect between men who carried responsibility for others. The younger officer nodded slowly. The explanation felt simple, yet it carried a depth that became clearer the longer he considered it. Outside the barracks, footsteps approached along the gravel path. A pair of American guards walked their evening patrol between the buildings. Their voices carried briefly through the cool air before fading toward the gate at the far end of the compound. In the command office across the yard, Captain Daniel Carter stood beside the same narrow window where he had watched the camp earlier that afternoon. A lantern burned on his desk beside a stack of reports waiting for review. The captain had finished most of his paperwork, but he had not yet left the office for the night. His eyes moved across the quiet rows of barracks where the German officers now rested after the long day. Carter thought again about the moment in the yard that morning. It had not been planned. It had simply felt right. He understood that some officers might have handled the situation differently. Some would have insisted on the salute as a matter of strict command. Yet the captain believed that discipline could exist without humiliation. A soldier who understood dignity often showed stronger loyalty to order than one forced into submission. The lantern flickered softly as a cool breeze moved through the slightly open window. Carter closed the final report and set his pen beside it. Outside, the camp settled into its night rhythm. The guards continued their patrol. The prisoners spoke quietly in their barracks. And somewhere beyond the fences, a church bell from a distant Bavarian village rang slowly across the valley, marking another evening in a world that was slowly learning how to live after the war. Morning arrived with a thin layer of mist settling over the valley beyond the camp fences. The Bavarian hills appeared soft and gray under the early light, and the air carried the clean smell of damp grass mixed with wood smoke drifting from distant farmhouses. Inside the prisoner compound, the day began as it always did. Guards moved along the perimeter in steady patrols. Kitchen workers carried metal containers toward the mess hall. Somewhere near the gate, a truck engine turned over slowly before settling into a low idle. Routine had a comforting rhythm even inside a place built from wire and watchtowers. In the officers' barracks, General Friedrich Adler woke before most of the other prisoners. Years of military discipline had fixed his habits long before the war began, and sleep rarely stretched past the first light of morning. He sat on the edge of the narrow bunk for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the camp waking around him. Boots on gravel. A door opening. The distant clang of a metal pot in the kitchen yard. Adler stood and moved to the window. A faint fog hovered just above the ground, drifting slowly across the open space between the barracks and the fence. From this angle, he could see the command building nearly 100 yards away. The small wooden structure stood simple and practical, its porch facing the yard where the inspection had taken place the previous morning. The memory returned clearly. The silence. The raised hand of the American captain. The unexpected answer to a challenge that had not even been spoken aloud. Adler folded his hands behind his back as he watched the mist move across the gravel. One of the younger officers approached from the hallway and stopped beside him at the window. The man was a former staff colonel who had served in logistics units during the final years of the war. His voice remained respectful when he spoke. He asked whether the general believed the American captain had intended to send a message with that gesture. Adler did not answer right away. Instead, he observed a pair of American soldiers crossing the yard toward the supply shed. Their movements were relaxed but disciplined, the casual confidence of men who knew their duties and trusted the structure around them. Finally, Adler spoke quietly. He said that sometimes the clearest message was the one that required no speech at all. The colonel considered this for a moment and nodded. Outside, the morning fog began to thin as the sun climbed above the hills. The yard slowly filled with sharper light. Guards took their places for the daily inspection, and the prisoners moved into loose formation once again. The rhythm of camp life allowed little room for drama. Most days passed with predictable order. Yet the memory of yesterday's moment still lingered quietly among the men assembling in the yard. Several officers glanced toward the command building without meaning to. Across the compound, Captain Daniel Carter stepped onto the porch of that same building with a folder tucked beneath his arm. The young officer paused briefly at the top step and surveyed the camp. His eyes moved across the fence line, the guard towers, the rows of barracks where hundreds of prisoners began their day. Carter had learned during the war that leadership rarely appeared in loud speeches or grand displays. Most of the time it appeared in small decisions made quietly when no one expected them. The captain descended the steps and walked toward the yard, his boots producing the steady crunch of gravel beneath them. The guards straightened slightly as he approached. Several prisoners noticed the movement and followed it with their eyes. Carter reached the center of the yard and opened the folder to review the morning roster. His expression remained calm, the same steady composure the prisoners had seen the day before. General Adler watched from the line of officers as the captain read the report. The general noticed the careful way the young American checked each detail before giving instructions. There was no arrogance in his posture, only the quiet assurance of someone who understood responsibility. When Carter finished reading, he closed the folder and looked across the assembled formation. For a brief moment his eyes met Adler's. The exchange lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Yet the recognition between them was unmistakable. Two soldiers acknowledging that the unusual moment of the previous day had not been forgotten. The inspection began again with the same routine orders and careful movements. Salutes rose and lowered in perfect rhythm. The morning proceeded exactly as expected. Yet beneath the ordinary routine of the camp, something subtle had changed. A quiet understanding had taken root, one that required no explanation and no announcement. In a place defined by fences and regulations, respect had found its own quiet space to exist. The days that followed settled into the familiar rhythm of camp life. Yet the quiet shift that had begun in the yard continued to ripple through the routines of both prisoners and guards. Morning inspections came and went with the same careful order. Roll calls were taken. Work details were assigned. Trucks arrived twice a week carrying food supplies from a nearby American depot nearly 15 miles down the valley road. On the surface, everything appeared exactly as regulations intended. But among the men who lived inside the fences, small changes were easy to notice. General Friedrich Adler moved through the compound with the same steady composure he had always carried. Yet the younger officers who watched him sensed that something thoughtful had settled behind his quiet expression. He spent more time walking the gravel path that circled the officers' barracks, his hands folded behind his back as he observed the daily movements of the camp. From that path he could see the watchtowers standing at the corners of the fence line, the guards pacing in slow measured steps, and the distant hills that turned pale green as spring deepened across the Bavarian countryside. Sometimes he paused near the fence where the valley opened beyond the trees. From there the outside world looked almost peaceful. Farm fields stretched across the low ground. A narrow church steeple rose from a village perhaps 2 miles away. The war that had shaken continents now felt strangely distant in the quiet of that valley. One afternoon, nearly a week after the moment in the yard, a small detail of officers was assigned to assist with organizing supplies inside the camp storage building. The work was simple. Wooden crates filled with canned goods needed to be counted and stacked according to the camp inventory lists. American guards supervised the work, though their manner remained professional rather than harsh. Among the prisoners moving crates inside the building was General Adler himself. Rank carried little privilege inside the camp when practical tasks were required. The general lifted a crate carefully and placed it on a stack beside the door, his movements deliberate and controlled despite his age. Across the room, an American sergeant checked off numbers on a clipboard while another guard held the storage door open to let in fresh air. Sunlight poured through the doorway, illuminating particles of dust that floated slowly through the beams of light. After nearly an hour of work, footsteps approached along the gravel outside. The guards near the entrance straightened instinctively. Captain Daniel Carter stepped into the doorway, removing his gloves as he entered the building. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, not through tension, but through the quiet attention soldiers naturally gave their commanding officer. Carter walked slowly between the rows of stacked crates, glancing at the inventory sheets the sergeant held in his hands. When he reached the doorway again, his eyes briefly fell on Adler, standing near the wall beside a stack of boxes marked with American supply stamps. The two men regarded each other for a moment. There was no formality required inside the storage building. No inspection underway. Just a room filled with soldiers completing ordinary work. Carter gave a small nod of acknowledgement, the kind one professional might offer another across a quiet room. Adler returned the gesture with equal restraint. The exchange lasted only a second before Carter turned his attention back to the sergeant and asked a routine question about the supply count. Yet several of the officers nearby noticed the moment. They had learned to recognize the subtle signals that passed between experienced soldiers. Respect did not always appear in ceremony. Sometimes it appeared in a simple nod shared in passing. Outside the building, the afternoon sun had grown warmer, and the valley beyond the camp fences shimmered with early spring color. As the work detail finished, stacking the last crates, Adler stepped back toward the open doorway and paused briefly in the sunlight. The breeze carried the faint sound of distant church bells from the village across the fields. For a moment the general closed his eyes, listening. When he opened them again, he noticed Captain Carter standing near the porch of the command building across the yard. The young American had removed his cap and was reading a folded letter, perhaps one that had arrived from home that morning. Adler watched quietly for a moment before turning back toward the barracks path. In a place built for confinement, moments of simple humanity often passed unnoticed by the outside world. Yet inside the fences, those moments sometimes carried the deepest meaning of all. Spring continued to unfold across the valley, and with it came longer days that stretched golden light across the camp yard well into the evening hours. The fences, watchtowers, and gravel paths remained unchanged, yet the landscape beyond them slowly softened with color. Fields turned green. Trees along the distant road filled with new leaves. Sometimes the wind carried the scent of damp soil and wild grass through the compound, reminding everyone inside the wire that the world beyond the war had begun to move forward again. Inside the camp, the routines continued with the steady rhythm that military life demanded. Inspections, work details, supply checks, and quiet evenings in the barracks. Yet the small moment that had taken place days earlier between Captain Daniel Carter and General Friedrich Adler had not been forgotten. Among the American guards, it had become a quiet story repeated during evening patrols. Among the German officers, it had become something closer to reflection. Not a tale of victory or humiliation. Something more complicated. One late afternoon, a light rain drifted across the valley, the kind that falls softly enough to settle dust without sending men running for shelter. The guards along the fence pulled their coats tighter while prisoners moved slowly between buildings, finishing the day's assigned tasks. Water darkened the gravel paths and gathered in small shallow pools near the corners of the yard. From the porch of the command building, Captain Carter watched the rain fall across the camp. A folded map rested on the railing beside him, and a pencil moved slowly between his fingers as he considered the notes he had written earlier. That day, plans were already underway for transferring several groups of prisoners to larger camps farther west. The war had ended, but the process of reorganizing thousands of soldiers across occupied Germany would take months, perhaps longer. Carter closed the map and looked across the compound toward the officers' barracks. A few figures stood under the small overhang near the entrance, waiting for the rain to pass. One of them was General Adler. The older man stood with the same composed posture he carried everywhere, his hands resting loosely behind his back as he watched the quiet rain move across the yard. Carter studied the scene for a moment before stepping down from the porch and crossing the gravel path. The rain dampened the shoulders of his uniform, but he did not quicken his pace. By the time he reached the barracks overhang, the rain had softened even further, becoming little more than a fine mist drifting through the air. Several officers stepped slightly aside to give the captain space. Adler turned his head when he heard the approaching footsteps. For a brief moment, the two men stood side by side under the narrow shelter, looking out toward the fence where the rain tapped gently against the wire. The silence felt natural rather than awkward. Finally, Carter spoke in a calm voice, the interpreter from the previous inspection standing nearby to assist if needed. The captain mentioned that the valley looked peaceful when it rained like this. Adler listened to the translation and nodded slightly. He replied that quiet rain had always sounded the same no matter which army a man served in. The words carried a faint hint of reflection rather than regret. Carter glanced toward the distant hills where low clouds rested along the slopes. He said that when he was younger he used to watch storms roll across the wheat fields back home in Oklahoma. Adler listened carefully before answering that he had once watched summer thunderstorms gather over the forests of Prussia during field exercises long before the war had reached its later years. The conversation remained brief and simple. Two soldiers speaking not as enemies, but as men who had both spent much of their lives beneath changing skies. After a moment, Carter nodded politely and stepped back toward the path that led to the command building. Adler watched him walk away through the light rain until the young captain reached the porch once again. The general then turned his attention back toward the quiet yard. Around him, the officers remained silent, sensing that the brief exchange had carried meaning beyond its few ordinary words. Sometimes history recorded its loudest events in official documents and headlines. But sometimes its most lasting moments occurred quietly, beneath soft rain, between two soldiers who understood that respect could survive even after war had ended. The rain ended during the night, leaving the camp washed clean beneath a pale morning sky. Small drops of water still clung to the wire fences and the wooden railings along the command building porch. When the first light spread across the valley, the ground shimmered with moisture, reflecting the soft glow of sunrise like a sheet of glass laid across the gravel yard. The camp stirred awake with its familiar rhythm. Guards changed shifts in the watchtowers. A cook opened the kitchen doors, and the smell of warm coffee drifted across the compound. Somewhere near the storage shed a hammer tapped steadily as a soldier repaired a loose plank on the fence. Captain Daniel Carter stepped outside the command building with a tin mug of coffee in his hand. The air felt cooler after the rain, fresh and quiet. From the porch, he could see nearly the entire compound. The officers' barracks stood about 90 yards away, their roofs still dark with moisture. Beyond them, the fence traced a long straight line toward the far watchtower where a sentry leaned against the railing scanning the valley road below. Carter took a slow sip of coffee and listened to the quiet sounds of morning beginning again. War had taught him to appreciate these calm moments more than he ever had before. During the last months of fighting there had been few quiet mornings. Now the silence of the valley carried a kind of relief that could not be easily explained. Across the yard the door of the officers' barracks opened, and several German officers stepped outside. Among them was General Friedrich Adler. The older man paused just outside the doorway and looked toward the hills beyond the camp as if measuring the weather for the day ahead. The rain had cleared the sky completely. Sunlight now reached across the valley and touched the distant fields where farmers had already begun their spring work. From this distance, small tractors moved slowly across the land like dark shapes sliding through the green. Adler watched the scene quietly. A younger officer beside him mentioned that the valley reminded him of farmland near his own hometown in Bavaria before the war had drawn him away. Adler listened, but did not immediately reply. His thoughts drifted elsewhere, perhaps across years rather than miles. Finally, he said that the land always returned to its seasons no matter what men did upon it. The younger officer nodded thoughtfully. Both men knew how much the land of Europe had endured during the war. Yet here in this valley the fields seemed determined to continue their quiet cycle of planting and harvest. The inspection call sounded across the yard a few minutes later. Prisoners moved into formation once again, boots crunching softly on damp gravel. The American guards took their positions with practiced ease. Captain Carter set his empty mug on the porch railing and walked down toward the center of the yard. The sunlight followed him across the ground, brightening the water droplets that still clung to the fence wires. The formation settled into its orderly lines. Names were called, numbers confirmed. It was the same routine repeated day after day. Yet as Carter read through the roster, he felt the same quiet awareness he had felt since that first morning with the general. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the camp. Not discipline. Discipline remained as firm as ever. But beneath it there now existed a layer of mutual understanding that had not been present before. When the inspection ended, Carter closed the roster folder and looked briefly toward the line of officers. General Adler stood in the same composed posture he always carried, his expression calm beneath the early sunlight. Their eyes met once again for a brief moment across the yard. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Both men understood that the strange moment they had shared days earlier had quietly altered the tone of life inside the compound. Respect, once demonstrated, rarely needed to be repeated. Carter dismissed the formation, and the prisoners moved back toward their assigned duties. The camp returned to its steady rhythm of work and watchfulness. Yet as the morning advanced and the valley filled with sunlight, many of the soldiers present carried with them the quiet realization that even in the aftermath of a war that had divided nations, a single gesture between two men could remind everyone watching what it truly meant to remain a soldier. The afternoon stretched quietly across the camp as the sun moved higher above the valley. Warm light rested on the gravel yard and the wooden walls of the barracks, drying the last traces of rain that had fallen the night before. Beyond the fences, the countryside looked peaceful, almost untouched by the long years that had shaken the continent. Farmers moved slowly across their fields with small tractors, and occasionally the faint sound of church bells carried across the hills when the wind shifted in the right direction. Inside the compound, the daily work details continued with steady order. Some prisoners sorted supply crates in the storage shed, while others repaired sections of fencing that had loosened during the winter storms. American guards moved nearby, keeping watch but speaking little, their routines shaped by the same discipline that guided the prisoners. Late in the afternoon, a group of officers gathered near the narrow path beside the barracks where the sunlight lingered longest. The gravel there had warmed throughout the day, and several men stood quietly enjoying the rare comfort of dry ground and fresh air. Among them was General Friedrich Adler. The older officer listened as two younger men discussed rumors about possible transfers to larger camps farther west. Such rumors moved quickly through prisoner compounds, carried from one conversation to another until they became something almost like weather forecasts. Adler did not interrupt the discussion. Instead, he watched the distant hills where the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. Across the yard, the command building door opened, and Captain Daniel Carter stepped outside with a folded document in his hand. A messenger from the regional headquarters had delivered several official notices earlier that afternoon, and Carter had spent the last hour reviewing them carefully. One of those notices confirmed that a number of senior German officers would soon be relocated to a central holding facility nearly 60 miles away. The transfer would take place within the next week. Carter stood on the porch for a moment reading the document again. Administrative orders rarely carried emotion, yet he understood that each name on the list represented a life that had traveled through extraordinary circumstances before arriving inside this quiet camp. His eyes moved slowly across the page until they paused on one name that stood out clearly among the others. Friedrich Adler. Carter folded the paper and rested his hands on the porch railing. The valley stretched wide before him, glowing with the soft amber color of approaching evening. For a moment he remained still, considering the quiet chain of events that had unfolded since the morning when the general first refused the salute. Neither man had spoken about that moment since it occurred, yet its meaning had quietly shaped the tone of every day that followed. Carter knew that soldiers sometimes crossed paths for only a short time before history carried them in different directions again. War was full of such brief intersections. Still, certain encounters remained memorable long after they ended. In the officers' area near the barracks, Adler turned slightly and noticed the captain standing on the porch across the yard. The distance between them was nearly 100 yards, yet the general recognized the familiar posture of the young American officer immediately. Their eyes met again across the compound, just as they had during the inspection days earlier. This time the moment lasted a little longer. Adler sensed that something in the captain's expression had changed, though he could not yet know the reason. Finally, Carter gave a small nod across the distance, a gesture so subtle that few others noticed it. Adler returned the nod with equal restraint. Around them, the camp continued its quiet evening routine. Guards walked their posts. Prisoners finished their assigned tasks and began returning toward the barracks as the sun lowered behind the hills. Soon the evening bell would sound, and the compound would settle once more into the calm rhythm of night. Yet for the two soldiers who had shared that unusual moment days before, The approaching sunset carried a quiet understanding that time inside the valley was drawing toward its natural conclusion. Some meetings between soldiers lasted only minutes. Others left an impression that endured long after the uniforms were folded away. In the fading light of that Bavarian evening, both men sensed that the brief chapter they had shared inside the wire fences was nearing its final page. The next morning arrived clear and bright, the sky stretching wide above the Bavarian valley, as if the rain of previous days had washed every cloud away. Sunlight poured across the camp fences and the long gravel yard, turning the dew on the grass beyond the wire into thousands of small silver reflections. Inside the compound, the routine began as it always did. Guards rotated shifts in the watchtowers. The kitchen doors opened, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the morning air. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of camp life, a quiet sense of anticipation moved through the officers' barracks. Word had spread during the night that several senior officers would soon be transferred to another facility farther west. Rumors often circulated in prisoner camps, but this time the information had come from official sources. Shortly after the morning inspection, Captain Daniel Carter stepped out of the command building carrying a folded document beneath his arm. Two soldiers stood beside a parked transport truck near the gate, checking the vehicle before departure. The truck would leave before noon, carrying several prisoners to a central holding camp approximately 60 miles away. Carter walked across the yard with calm, measured steps. The sunlight reflected softly from the metal gate behind the truck, and the quiet valley beyond the fence seemed almost too peaceful for a place that had once prepared men for war. Near the officers' barracks, General Friedrich Adler stood among a small group of prisoners waiting for instructions. His posture remained as composed as ever, though the younger officers beside him sensed the significance of the moment. Transfers often meant uncertainty. New camps, new routines, new faces. Yet Adler's expression showed none of the anxiety that sometimes accompanied such news. Instead, he observed the yard with the same thoughtful calm he had carried since his arrival weeks earlier. Captain Carter approached the group and stopped a few feet away. The interpreter from previous inspections stepped forward automatically, ready to translate if necessary. Carter unfolded the document and read several names aloud in a steady voice. Each officer acknowledged his name quietly and stepped aside near the truck. When Carter spoke the name Friedrich Adler, the general inclined his head once in confirmation and moved toward the small group assembling near the vehicle. The entire exchange remained orderly, almost ceremonial in its calm efficiency. When the list was complete, the soldiers prepared the truck for departure. A guard checked the rear gate, while another secured several canvas bags containing personal belongings. The process took only a few minutes. Yet, during that short time, Captain Carter walked slowly toward the vehicle where Adler now stood beside the others awaiting transport. The captain stopped within a few feet of the general. For a moment, neither man spoke. The quiet valley stretched around them, the distant fields glowing softly under the morning sun. Finally, Carter extended his hand. The gesture was simple and unmistakably human. The interpreter began to step forward, but Carter raised his other hand slightly, indicating that translation was unnecessary. Adler looked at the offered hand for a brief moment. Then he reached forward and accepted it with a firm, steady grip. The handshake lasted only a second, yet its meaning required no explanation. Two soldiers acknowledging each other before their paths separated. When the handshake ended, Carter stepped back and gave a small nod. Adler returned the gesture with equal respect. The truck engine started with a low mechanical rumble. Guards opened the rear gate, and the prisoners climbed aboard one by one. Adler stepped into the vehicle last, pausing briefly before taking his place beside the others. As the truck rolled slowly toward the camp gate, Carter remained standing in the yard watching its movement. The metal gate opened, and the vehicle passed through, turning onto the narrow road that led down the valley. For several seconds the truck remained visible between the trees, then it disappeared beyond a bend in the road. The camp grew quiet again as the gate closed behind it. Captain Carter stood motionless for a moment longer before turning back toward the command building. The routines of the camp would continue. New prisoners would arrive. Others would depart. Yet somewhere along that winding road beyond the valley, one general carried with him the memory of a moment that had begun with refusal and ended with respect. Years passed after the truck disappeared down the narrow road beyond the Bavarian Valley. The war that had once consumed continents slowly settled into the quiet pages of history books, and the prisoner camps scattered across Germany gradually emptied as soldiers returned home to rebuild the lives they had left behind. Fields that had once echoed with the movement of armies returned to the steady rhythm of planting and harvest. Town squares filled again with ordinary voices. The long shadow of war did not vanish overnight, but the world moved forward the way it always had, one season after another. For Captain Daniel Carter, the months following that spring in Bavaria brought new assignments and new responsibilities. The army transferred him first to another administrative post and eventually back across the Atlantic Ocean. By the time he stepped off a transport ship in New York Harbor nearly a year later, the uniform he wore carried the quiet wear of long service. He returned to Oklahoma, where the wide fields of wheat and the slow rolling horizon looked almost exactly as he remembered them. Life there felt simple compared to the years he had spent in Europe. Yet certain memories from the war remained vivid. Not the noise or the movement of armies, but the quiet moments when men revealed who they truly were beneath the weight of history. One of those memories belonged to a morning inside a small prisoner camp in Bavaria. Far across the ocean, General Friedrich Adler also moved slowly back into civilian life once the final processes of repatriation allowed him to return home. The Germany he came back to looked very different from the one he had known before the war. Cities carried scars that would take years to rebuild, and many of the old institutions of the army he had served for decades had vanished entirely. Yet Adler remained the same man who had once stood in that gravel yard with calm dignity. Those who knew him later in life often noticed that he spoke rarely about the battles of the war. Instead, he sometimes told a quieter story about an American captain he had met during his time as a prisoner. He never described the moment with dramatic language. The story was simple. One soldier had offered respect when another refused to surrender it. Years later, long after both men had removed their uniforms for the final time, the memory of that small encounter continued to carry meaning. For Adler, it had been a reminder that the profession of a soldier extended beyond the borders of any single nation. For Carter, it had become proof that leadership sometimes appeared not through command, but through restraint. Somewhere in the distance between Oklahoma and Germany, two lives continued on separate paths, shaped by the same brief moment of understanding. Neither man likely imagined that the story of that quiet exchange would one day be repeated by others who heard it secondhand, passed along like a small piece of history that survived outside official records. Yet that is often how the most human moments of war endure. They do not appear in strategy maps or government archives. They remain instead in the memories of those who witnessed them, and in the quiet recollection of two soldiers who once stood across from one another beneath a pale Bavarian sky. There remained a simple truth that neither victory nor defeat could erase. War may decide who wins the battlefield, but respect decides who remains a soldier.